Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back in to bring you all that you need to know for Disc Priest for Season 4 for Raids and Mythic Plus, along with some of the items that you want to be purchasing and targeting with the new Bullion vendor coming in the Awakened season. Keep in mind that the raids are going to cycle every week. You're going to have a new raid, and that might mess around with some of the talents and how you're playing with some of the timings. So make sure you check out our Wowhead guides, as they also have raid boss tips, including some of the timings for when you want to be ramping. So let's get into it. Disc Priest is the quintessential damage to healing healer. And with this, you're applying light spells in Shield, Powered Radiance, Flash Heal, and Renew to be able to apply atonements to your allies to then deal damage to yield healing onto them. Damage trinkets and non-priest damage do not actually convert into atonement healing. So if you have like an engineering item that does damage, or you're running with Beacon of the Beyond or Bellarellos, those abilities do not convert into atonement healing. AoE priest abilities like Halo, Divine Star, Inescapable Torment, Holy Nova, all these AoE damage abilities only convert into atonement healing off of one enemy that you strike. And so yeah, it might be tempting to try to get all this AoE damage, but it's not going to be full topping and lay on handsing people. Another important note is boss enemies that are taking 99% less damage. If they are taking 99% less damage, you are still going to be able to damage that target and do 100% atonement healing. It'll even benefit from things like Schism, which is coming from Mind Blast these days. You're still going to be doing the same atonement healing as if they took all the regular damage. That also means that if there's any target vulnerabilities where they take more damage, your atonement healing is still going to be the same. But if you are fighting an enemy that is immune to damage, something like Azure Blade, I think that the boss is still immune when it actually goes into the center of the room. If you're dealing damage to Azure Blade when she goes immune, then you're doing no atonement healing whatsoever, so be very careful about that. While your atonement appliers are light spells, you're usually using a variety of shadow spells to be able to yield heavy amounts of damage, and that primarily comes from your pet, which is activating Shadow Covenant, which is causing your shadow abilities to hit harder, to be able to produce more output, to be able to put together larger bursts of healing to top off your allies. Your tier set synergizes with this perfectly, increasing the damage of Smite and Penance with your 2 set, and extending 1 active atonement by 2 seconds, the same as we have right now in Emirdrasil. And the 4 set is absolutely critical to getting more uptime and value out of your Shadow Covenant by making it so that Smite also hits a second time, now as a shadow spell, which is of course increasing your damage, but it's also contributing to more cooldown reduction for your pet. This tier set substantially increases your Shadow Covenant uptime, because the more smites you're able to cast during Shadow Covenant, you're getting that second smite hit, which is also contributing to the Void Summoner talent, which is contributing more cooldown reduction, allowing you to get more Shadow Covenant uptime and be able to better protect your allies and increase your own damage. So if more smites are going to be able to yield more uptime for Shadow Covenant, well, haste is just fantastic. And the priority for both raids and M+ is starting with huge amounts of haste. And I'm talking actually huge amounts. I think right now on Season 3, I'm running somewhere along the lines of like 41% or so. You're probably going to go even a little bit higher into the Awakened season just because of all the stats that are coming in on hand. And depending on the talent setup, which we're going to get to in a little bit, more haste is just going to help you get more smites out, more hits out from your smite during a Shadow Covenant uptime, giving you more cooldown reduction and more value from it. Following it up with that, in a raid environment, I try to go with haste, crit, then verse, then mastery. And in a Mythic Plus environment, I usually am trying to go with very heavy versatility after haste, followed again by crit and mastery. The versatility is incredibly important for dungeons, especially with the ridiculous amount of survivability checks that dungeons are throwing at you. And of course, it's not going to be costing you much on healing to be able to take that stat instead of crit strike. For the incoming season, you're going to have access to all of the Dragonflight raid trinkets thanks to the Bullion vendor. You're going to get 1 Bullion a week by killing raid bosses, and then every 2 Bullions, you'll be able to purchase 1 item. So, what items are looking good this season? Let's dive into it. Overall, they have nerfed a few different items, one of which was Rashok's receiving a lot of nerfs after the Aberrus raid tier. Whispering Incarnate Icon received a lot of nerfs as well. So usually the top trinket you'd want to be looking at overall would probably be something like the Ominous Chromatic Essence. Particularly if you're raiding, but I think also if you're M+ing as well. This trinket looks like it's going to be used very heavily by a variety of people, and so you're able to benefit for getting haste for yourself, or whichever stat you would like to adjust it to or attune it to, but you're also buffing your allies along the way. Incarnate Icon is still pretty good, but it's not really going to be used to buff anybody else, since most DPS and tanks and everything are not going to be running with that item. So for a raid focus, I'm going to be looking to get OCE, the Ominous Chromatic Essence, with my Booleon. If raid was my only focus, of course, followed by Vakash, which is the weapon that you're getting off of Farak, just so I can have one great trinket, one great weapon to be able to go alongside it. If you're still raid focused, that second trinket might kind of depend on what your preferences are going for. I think Ashes of the Ember Soul is going to be a decent option. I think Pips and Whispering Incarnate Icon are all kind of like decent setups, but the trinket options for Disc are looking pretty boring, and it doesn't seem like there's a great on-use trinket to go with the cooldown of Evangelism like we had with Balefire Branch in Season 3. From a Mythic Plus focus, you have a great amount of options on hand. Ominous Chromatic Essence is still a great stat stick to be able to bring to your party. Vakash is still a great weapon to be able to utilize. I think depending on your needs, this is where it's a little murky for Mythic Plus. Ward of Faceless Ire is fantastic, especially if you pug a lot, because it's about a half health shield that you're able to apply to allies to save them from danger, and it's on a 1 minute cooldown, giving you really high uptime and really high value. Farak's Tainted Rage Heart is a nice mix between damage and survivability, but it's only for yourself, unlike Ward, which you could start tossing out onto allies or yourself, depending on the needs that you have. Finally, Rashok's does a pretty good job of buffing allies with the versatility that it gains or gives to others, and if you're looking to be able to grab a trinket that's going to be buffing and improving other people, even if it kind of brings down your output a little bit, Rashok's could be one that you would look for, but I don't think I'm really going to utilize it as a disc in a Mythic Plus environment pretty much at all. When it comes to your talents for Mythic Plus, this is about the build, and it's again going to be linked in the description down below as well if you'd like to go with the import code. There's a bit of flexibility with some of the points. Twilight Equilibrium, usually how you're utilizing this, and we'll also go over it in the playstyle in just a second, is weaving between a shadow spell and a light spell. This isn't quite as powerful as previous seasons, and so if you didn't want to deal with the headache, you could easily just put the other point into Blaze of Light. Some people also take the Divine Aegis point out and put it into Blaze if they're running with like painfully low amounts of crit because they're so heavily focused on their versatility. Your other talent points, you always want to make sure you're taking Protector of the Frail and being really aggressive with your pain step uses. Some things like Sanctuary kind of produce a decent amount of output, but it's all really getting consumed by auto attacks. It doesn't really like save people from death or save people from danger. A lot of times just the boss auto attacking the tank is the majority of Sanctuary's output. As I mentioned before, Shadow Covenant is the base of really most of your output as a Disc Priest. When you activate Mindbender or Shadow Fiend, you're then activating Shadow Covenant as well, turning Halo, Divine Star, Penance into shadow spells, and increasing your damage by 30% when you're running in with Mindbender, and it's even stronger if you're running in with Shadow Fiend. You're always running with Mindbender in a dungeon environment because of the higher levels of uptime that it's going to be granting you. Some people do prefer to run with Enduring Luminescence because it feels a little bit better. Personally, I like running Bright Pupil. I'm okay not having about a second of extra atonement uptime and casting it a little bit slower if it means that I get 5 seconds off of my cooldowns for the Radiance, so I can just be casting them more frequently, which is also giving some good synergy with Harsh Discipline. Unfortunately, some talents like Uppies, like Ultimate Penitence, are just not that great. There's been a few different times they've tried to be able to buff it and make it strong enough, but it's still not quite there. Talents like Ultimate Penitence, Expiation, and even like Aegis of Wrath aren't really taken these days. Contrition, there's a few different dead branches on these trees which are just not that good. So usually you're just speccing into this one build for all of your Mythic Plus needs. When it comes to your gameplay in a Mythic Plus environment, as I mentioned before, you have a variety of abilities to apply Atonement to your allies. These are friendly buffs, these are healing spells you're placing on them, which don't really do a ton of output on their own. Your priority is to use your healing spells to apply these buffs and then follow through with heavy amounts of damage. A frequent mistake I see a lot of people make with Disc is they're trying to cast a damage spell 1 minute and then cast a healing spell another to apply an extra atonement. You're not weaving between those spells constantly. It's sort of like you're in healing mode where you're applying buffs to allies, and then you're in damage mode where you're dealing as much damage as you can, squeezing every last drop of value that you can from atonement uptime, and then going back to apply fresh buffs onto your allies. What this means in a dungeon environment is you're usually using shield onto the tank to be able to apply and maintain the buff if they're the only one taking damage or you're about to walk into a new trash pull. Then you're following it up with Radiance as your bread and butter to be able to apply atonements to everybody. Keep in mind, Radiance applies atonement to allies within 30 yards of your target. So if players are standing all over the place, you might want to cast Radiance off yourself so that it's going to bounce off you, and then you're going to be able to hit everybody with those atonements. And then this is where you follow it up with dealing damage. Usually what I'm doing walking into trash packs is I'm multi-dotting with Purge the Wicked, as it is a light spell doing good amounts of damage, and I want to make sure I'm maintaining and spreading it by hitting penance onto enemies. That being said, I'll walk into trash packs and start dotting as the tank is corralling everything together, keeping atonement on the tank with shield or any flash heal procs I might have with Surge of Light. And then when I know that everybody is going to be taking damage, I will apply atonement to all of my allies with Radiance, and then this is where you go into full damage mode. I'll then hit my Mindbender, followed up with Mind Blast into Penance, and Smites to be able to go with it. During Shadow Covenant, you also want to keep in mind that the more smites you're getting out, the more cooldown reduction you're netting for your Mindbender, allowing you to get even more Shadow Covenant uptime to be able to follow. So if you want to maximize around Twilight Equilibrium, what you can do is you can hit Mind Blast, followed up with a Smite, hit a Penance, which is now Dark because it becomes Dark Reprimand during Shadow Covenant, followed up with a Smite, and continue on from there. I usually am not using much of any Purge the Wicked during the Shadow Covenant window, because the more smites you're getting out, again, the more uptime of Shadow Covenant you get as a whole. So you want to be leaning on Mind Blast, Penance, Shadow or Death, absolutely, if you're in Execute phase. But even if you're not in Execute phase, you want to make sure that you are taking advantage of it for the cleave damage that you're getting out of the talent Inescapable Torment, which is extending the duration of your squid and doing really large AoE damage. With Mindbender up, Mind Blast, Penance, Shadow or Death on cooldown, then you'd be looking to use Halo and then smashing Smites as heavily as you possibly can. Keep in mind that Smite is also bringing back the cooldown of Penance thanks to the Train of Thought talent, so getting more of those Penance outs is also going to be causing more damage for Inescapable Torment, extending the duration of your pet, and it's going to be spreading Purge the Wicked to other enemies as well. You're going to be very aggressive with your pain sub use throughout dungeons, since the Protector of the Frail talent is also going to be giving you cooldown reduction for it when you're casting Shield. Rapture is kind of an underutilized cooldown a lot of times, and it feels kind of weak to be able to utilize in dungeons, so you want to make sure you're actually using it before you walk into trash packs, or before you really engage with trash packs. How I like to do it is, if I know that damage is going to be really spiky, or it might take the tank a while to actually rally together all of these enemies, I'll actually hit Rapture first, and then start shielding everybody before I get into any Purge the Wickeds, shield through all of my allies, then be able to set myself up for dealing damage by hitting the Mindbender and going into the damage rotation like we just talked about. And finally, to reiterate, you're not trying to jump between damage and healing all the time. And in fact, when there's moments where one person takes a hit, you often want to just use Radiance to be able to apply atonement to all of your allies in case somebody else takes damage. Let's say one person who is not the tank takes a heavy hit, and you don't know if there's going to be more damage that could happen a little bit later on, and you're about to have Mindbender back, or you already have it back. In that situation, just hit Radiance anyway, apply atonement to everybody, and don't worry about the overheal that's going to happen as a result, because it's a very high chance that somebody else is going to take damage. They'll already have atonement on them, and their health is going to get pushed right back up to full, while you're also healing up that ally that was injured. Too many times I see people who will only apply that one single atonement because they want to make sure they're min-maxing their overheal and not overhealing too much in a dungeon. And let me tell you, a lot of times it does more harm than good. It's actually better to have that overheal because there's not greater efficiency for like single target atonement healing as a Disc Priest. You're having Sins of the Many increasing your damage by a very massive margin, and it only decreases when you put atonements past 5 targets. So in a dungeon environment, your overheal really doesn't matter, and you're not getting punished as a result of it. So being very aggressive when you do have your pet out and just casting that fast radiance beforehand to make sure that if anybody does fall low, you're already pumping healing into them is going to make all the difference in the world. The spec does a really good job of pushing up everybody's health pools together, and certainly does struggle when you need to bomb lots of single target healing, which is where the Ward of Faceless Ire can come in, especially if you're pugging, but also the aggressive use of things like Pain Sup, Barrier, even Rapture if you need to be able to stabilize your party can make all the difference in the world as you're waiting for your Shadow Covenant or your Mindbender Squid to come back off cooldown. Right here we have the standard Mindbender setup that you're going to be looking at for a raiding environment. This is not too terribly different than what we just talked about in Mythic Plus. You're still running Bender. The double tap out of Smite is giving you more cooldown reduction out of things like Void Summoner. It's also giving you your penance back off cooldown thanks to Train of Thought, then allowing you to get more penances out to be able to trigger Inescapable Torment for a longer lasting squid that's also dealing more damage, which is also converting into atonement healing off the first enemy that it ends up hitting. You're also always running with Evangelism, which is an absolutely crucial cooldown, extend the duration of your atonements, and be able to provide a massive burst of healing. So your mission statement while running with either a Bender setup or what we're going to show you in a second with Shadow Fiend doesn't change, that you want to make sure you're applying atonements to your allies. I usually recommend using Rapture and Evangelism together, but applying atonement to all of your allies, first with Rapture, getting 8 to 10 shields out, following it up with back-to-back Radiance casts, extending the duration, and then dealing damage to be able to produce an excellent burst of healing onto your allies for about a 7 or 8 second period to be able to fully heal the raid all together all at once. When running with the Shadow Fiend setup, you'd be taking this point out of Mindbender and putting it into Twilight Equilibrium. Twilight Equilibrium could also be used in a Bender setup if you wanted to take a point out of Blaze, but often it definitely feels like Twilight Equilibrium is a lot weaker than it used to be. But Shadow Fiend in general is very good for when you're able to have greater spaces between damage events, and you want to make sure that you're able to burst really hard at those moments, really carry those moments. Some guilds on Tindril, for example, had their Disc Priests run with Shadow Fiend, and they covered the entirety of some of the seed soaks, whereas others, like my guild, had double Disc Priest, and we ran Benders, and we both had small ramps going, or smaller ramps going, but much more frequently for all of the seeds that we needed to be able to capture. So it kind of depends on what you're going with. Most of the time in a raid environment, I'd recommend using Rapture and Evangelism together. What you want to do is finding those damage mechanics, and I have a whole list of raid tips linked in the description down below for my Wowhead guides for identifying them fight by fight. But usually what I recommend doing is once you know when these damage events are going to happen, about 18 or 20 seconds before that damage is happening, refresh your Purge the Wicked, activate Rapture, and get out about 8 to 10 atonements via Powered Shield or the Surge of Light procs that you might end up picking up. I usually try to use those Surge of Light procs near the end so that I'm then able to apply atonement to myself with the Binding Heals talent, which applies atonement to your target and yourself when you use Flash Heal. Then I'm going to be following it up with casting both of my Radiance charges, and so I'm applying atonement to the full 20 members of my raid, extending their duration with Evangelism. So if you wanted to use Rapture and Evangelism together, you pretty much naturally use those cooldowns and get 20 atonements out that way. If you space them out, the thing I'm not a huge fan of is when you're having mini ramps, which we'll talk about in a second, you're leaning on Renew for that, and you're committing to using those Renews to be able to apply the 10 atonements you need before the double Radiance to then extend their duration, which sometimes can cost epic amounts of mana. So if you have an Innervate, that's fine. But if you don't, I like being able to use Rapture and Evangelism together, and then you can kind of pick and choose how many Renews you want to cast for those mini ramps that we'll talk about in just a moment, to then use as sort of like a mana burn, depending on how comfortable that your resources are going to be feeling. So if instead of having Rapture and Evangelism for a mini ramp, you would basically use Shield and Renew, and applying as many atonements as you feel comfortable with, usually like 4 to 6 single target atonements, and they're very expensive. They add up quickly in terms of their mana cost. But Radiances, while they cost a lot of mana, are incredibly efficient. So you apply like 4 to 6 atonements with Shield and Renew, double Radiance, and then you're going to follow it up with your damage rotation, which is going to be the same regardless of its Rapture, Evangelism, or a mini ramp. That profile is going to start by casting Shadow Fiend or Mindbender. In this example, Mindbender is going to be what we would recommend to you guys. Hitting Mind Blast, following it up with Penance, following it up with Shadow or Death, then Halo, and then Smites to be able to follow. If you were running with Twilight Equilibrium, you would want to Mind Blast, then Smite, then Penance, then Smite, then Shadow or Death to be able to weave between the Shadow and Light spells to be able to maximize your damage. Sometimes this can be really good to be able to utilize, especially if you need to like buy time. If you were a little bit early with your ramp, you can sort of buy time by casting that Smite until it's time to hit the Penance, because usually the full 8-bolt Penance is going to be doing the majority of your atonement healing. But keep in mind, you have a very limited window to be able to hit that damage and be able to start topping off your allies. And so there's not too much time that you can really gain from it, maybe a second or two. The usual flow of a fight like Smolderon, for example, is that you would put together your full-fledged ramp for one of the smashes that the boss is going to be doing into the group, and then you're going to be pounding as many smites as you possibly can to be able to get all the cooldown reduction you need to get your squid back. Then following it up, you realize that you're not going to have all your resources for the next smash the boss does, and this is where you'll be using Shield, Renews, Flash Heal procs, and then your double Radiance to be able to produce a mini ramp, produce some amount of healing, but also not have the full coverage onto that second smash. I know some people also split up their Rapture and Evangelism on that fight, but as I mentioned before, extra mana comes in quite a bit of clutch if you wanted to do that. The great thing about the Mindbender setup is if you're casting enough smites, you're always going to be able to have your Mindbender up for when you have both of your Radiance charges back. And so you'll always be using your Radiance charges back to back, so that you're having 10 atonements applied just from those alone, in addition to any of the single target atonements that your mana is allowing you to afford. So you'll be able to have the single target atonements, like I said, around 4 to 6, double Radiance, into your damage profile with Mindbender, and then casting as many smites as you can during downtime to get you your Mindbender cooldown back before your 2 Radiance charges come back off cooldown again, and then you're repeating that process. Especially when you're walking into Awakened raids and there's 3 different raids to learn and a variety of boss fights to learn, running with a Mindbender setup is going to mean that you may not catch every single burst of damage, but you're going to be more active than not and more regularly applying your healing to allies to be able to catch them back up, rather than having the larger downtime that something out of Shadow Fiend might grant you. Keep in mind, when you do get used to those timings, or you do have them set out ahead of time, then yes, if Shadow Fiend is going to be able to cover the entirety of an event, or other people are using cooldowns elsewhere, Shadow Fiend can be an absolute beast to be able to utilize. But it's also going to be a lot more punishing if you miss those timings. Now, Disc is a healer that is not meant to be blasting tons of healing onto the raid at all times. You are going to have downtime. You're going to have huge highs and low lows with your output, and that is how you are meant to function. Okay? You're going to have these moments where you're applying all of these atonements to your allies to cover the entire raid in the buff, extend their duration, and then deal damage. But there is very clear break-offs between healing and dealing damage. You're going to spend about 15-20 seconds applying atonements to allies, extend the duration, and then all of your activity time while those atonements are out is on dealing damage. Some of the most constant mistakes that I see people make are when they're trying to apply atonements and deal damage at the same time. You are doing one, you're extending its duration, and then that extended duration is giving you time to be able to deal damage. If you don't have Evangelism on hand, you apply atonements very quickly, get those Radiances out, and then blast damage for as long as those atonements are going to be up. When you are waiting to get your Radiance charges back or your squid back, you want to make sure you're keeping atonement on just the tanks. You could use Surge of Light procs to do a little bit of spot healing if you needed to, but you're predominantly adding damage with Smite and Penance to be able to help you get your Mindbender back, so it's always going to be aligning with the 30-second cooldown of the 2 Radiance charges. If you ran a Shadow Fiend build, it can get even more extreme, where you might just sit there for long periods of time and just be mashing Smite to make sure you have Shadow Fiend at the proper timings. That was something I did for rack progression, where I ran like 45% haste so that I would be able to sit there, pound Smites, and every massive damage event, I would then guarantee to be able to have that Shadow Fiend on hand. Those situations are more niche though. Some of the frequent mistakes I see for raids and Mythic Plus is, as I mentioned, weaving between healing and damage spells instead of just having a moment of atonement application and a moment of damage. Outside of those things, people are very conservative with their cooldowns. I really recommend running Protector of the Frail for both raids and M+ these days, especially if you're relearning encounters in either raids or keys. And this allows you to be very aggressive with your pain subs, whether you're using it on yourself or on other people. So that way you're going to be able to have that extra little layer of safety net with your defensives to keep other people alive. Some things that others really struggle with is using enough smite and speccing into enough haste so that they can get enough smite casts out to get the highest Shadow Covenant levels possible. In a key environment, I'm usually trying to be above 50% uptime with my Shadow Covenant, so that way I have the power I need to push up health pools when things get more dangerous. There's a lot of moments where people are applying Purge the Wickeds during Shadow Covenant windows, and they're missing out on the extra double taps of Smite that are going to be able to net them that additional healing later on down the line. So keep those things in mind. Another mistake I see is when people are missing out on where your atonement healing really comes from. When there's emergency situations and people are trying to lean on like the Radiances to heal everybody all at once, that really doesn't happen anymore. Radiance is quite a bit weaker than it was in the Aberrus raid tier, and you have to lean on your damage to be able to produce that healing. Other times, people are trying to be pitch perfect with having a full 20 atonement ramp in a raiding environment, and then the timing of it is poor, and then they end up having players die, or they're just not getting out as much healing because they were late. It's much better to be timely and even a little bit early with your atonement application rather than late, where people are potentially going to be dying, or you're stressing out other healers or making them use cooldowns a little bit earlier. Thanks so much for watching our Season 4 guide for Disc Priest. If you have any questions, make sure you let us know down in the description below, and be sure to follow the stream if you'd like to catch us while we're live and pushing keys in Season 4. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll catch y'all next time.